Today we are diving into one of the most fascinating stories from the medieval world, where faith, fear, and the battlefield collided. We often think of medieval wars as being fought only with swords, shields, and armor, but there was something else that soldiers carried with them into battle. Something invisible, but powerful enough to terrify entire armies. It wasn't a weapon made of steel. It was a prayer. And for centuries, this prayer was believed to summon divine protection, strike fear into enemies, and even change the outcome of wars. So why did this Catholic prayer terrify medieval armies? Let's walk through the story together. To understand this, we need to go back to a time when religion was not just a matter of private belief, but the center of life itself. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church was the heart of society. Kings bowed to the Pope. Entire laws were built upon Scripture, and people measured their lives by the sacraments of the Church. On the battlefield, soldiers believed they were not only fighting against men, but also against unseen spiritual forces. That meant that prayers and blessings were considered as essential as swords and armor. The specific prayer that came to terrify armies was known as the Prayer of Saint Michael the Archangel. Saint Michael was believed to be the leader of the heavenly hosts, the mighty warrior angel who casts Satan out of heaven. In Catholic tradition, he wasn't just a figure of piety. He was a general of divine armies, a symbol of ultimate protection and justice. When invoked, his prayer was believed to call down heavenly forces onto the battlefield. The words of the prayer spoke of defense against evil, protection from darkness, and the triumph of light over the enemy. Imagine being a soldier in the 11th or 12th century, hearing that your opponents had invoked the Archangel Michael before charging into battle. To you, it wouldn't just sound like a religious ritual. It would feel like the very angels of heaven were fighting on their side. That kind of belief was enough to crush morale before swords were even raised. During the Crusades, for example, the prayer was used often by knights and armies marching into the Holy Land. These warriors believed they were on a sacred mission. They carried crosses on their armor, relics in their camps, and prayers on their lips. The prayer of Saint Michael became like a spiritual shield. When they recited it, they believed no weapon formed against them could prosper. And their enemies knew this reputation as well. The thought of fighting an army that saw itself backed by angelic warriors was terrifying. But it wasn't only during the Crusades. Across Europe, during countless medieval battles, the prayer would echo across fields before armies clashed. Priests would walk along the lines of soldiers, blessing them, sprinkling holy water, and reciting the prayer. The effect was powerful. Men who might have been trembling with fear suddenly felt invincible. They believed heaven itself was on their side. At the same time, enemies could see this ritual and hear the words, and it struck terror in their hearts. It's important to remember that in the medieval mindset, the supernatural was very real. People believed in angels, demons, curses, and miracles with the same certainty we believe in science today. To them, this wasn't symbolic. It was reality. If you thought the enemy had angelic protection, how could you possibly win? Fear alone could break the will of an army, and history shows that morale often decides battles as much as weapons. One of the most famous uses of this prayer came during the Battle of Mont Saint-Michel in France. According to chronicles, the defenders invoked Saint Michael as their protector, and legend says that miraculous events turned the tide of the fight. The invaders fled, claiming they had seen visions of shining warriors in the sky. Whether or not it was true didn't matter. The story spread, and from then on, the prayer of Saint Michael gained even more reputation as a terrifying weapon of faith. Another layer to this is how the Church itself endorsed the prayer. Popes and bishops encouraged its use, declaring it a form of spiritual armor. Soldiers were taught that reciting it before combat was as important as sharpening their swords. The Church also declared certain prayers indulgenced, meaning they carried spiritual rewards for those who recited them. In other words, soldiers believed they could win both earthly battles and heavenly rewards through this prayer. That combination of fear and hope was a psychological force stronger than steel. We also need to understand the medieval fear of damnation. Soldiers were not only afraid of dying, they were afraid of dying in a state of sin and being cast into hell. The prayer of St. Michael reassured them that even in death they would be guarded by heaven. It promised that their souls would not fall into darkness. This gave them courage to fight without hesitation. Meanwhile, their enemies saw this confidence and were shaken by it. What could be more terrifying than fighting men who had no fear of death? But there was more than just St. Michael's prayer. Medieval armies also invoked the Psalms, particularly Psalm 91, often called the Soldier's Psalm. It spoke of God's protection, angels guarding the faithful, and safety even in the midst of arrows and battle. When chanted aloud by thousands of soldiers, these words filled the air with both power and fear. Again, to the medieval mind, these were not empty chants. They were believed to bring real protection. Even kings and emperors used these prayers as part of their military campaigns. Charlemagne, the great emperor of the Franks, was said to have relied on religious invocations before major battles. His armies carried relics of saints, banners marked with crosses, and priests who recited these terrifying prayers. When his enemies faced him, they were not only fighting soldiers, but also confronting the weight of divine authority. This blending of politics, religion, and warfare created a psychological advantage that was unmatched. We can also look at the stories of miracles connected to these prayers. Chronicles tell of arrows missing their targets, of soldiers spared in impossible circumstances, of enemies fleeing without reason. Whether or not these events were real doesn't matter to our story. What matters is that they were believed. And belief is what gives power to prayers on the battlefield. For medieval armies, perception was reality. If they thought heaven was against them, their courage could collapse instantly. The terror also came from the idea of curses. Many armies believed that when their enemies prayed to God and the saints, they were not only blessing themselves but cursing their opponents. Imagine being a soldier and hearing that the Pope himself had blessed the army you were about to fight, declaring your side as the enemy of God. That wasn't just politics. It felt like eternal judgment. Fighting under that shadow could break the will of even the strongest warrior. We should also note that medieval battles were as much about symbolism as strategy. Banners, chants, processions, and prayers all carried meaning. The prayer of St. Michael was often recited in unison, a thunderous sound that rolled across the field like a wave. The psychological effect of thousands of voices calling upon heaven was overwhelming. It created unity, courage, and fear all at once. And this fear lasted beyond the battlefield. Stories of armies invoking the prayer spread quickly. Tales of miraculous victories and divine interventions circulated in villages, monasteries, and courts. The legend grew larger with every telling. By the late Middle Ages, the prayer wasn't just a private devotion. It was seen as a weapon, one that could terrify not only soldiers, but entire nations. Even after the medieval period, the prayer retained its reputation. The Church officially included a version of it in its daily prayers, showing how deeply it had shaped the Catholic imagination. To this day, many Catholics still pray to St. Michael for protection against evil. But in the Middle Ages, the stakes were even higher. It wasn't just about personal safety. It was about the fate of kingdoms. What makes this story so fascinating is how it shows the power of belief. A simple prayer, made of words, could influence the outcome of wars because people believed it could. Fear is contagious, and faith is powerful. Together they created a force that terrified medieval armies long before swords even clashed. When we think about it today, it's almost hard to imagine. Modern armies rely on guns, tanks, and technology. But in the medieval world, the greatest weapon was often invisible. It was the conviction that God and his angels fought alongside you, and the fear that your enemies had that same power on their side. That's why this Catholic prayer, more than any weapon, terrified medieval armies. So the next time you think about medieval battles, remember that they weren't just about knights and castles. They were also about faith, fear and the power of prayer. Words spoken on the lips of soldiers could change the course of history. And among all those prayers, the invocation of Saint Michael stood above the rest, a cry that echoed through centuries, striking terror into the hearts of enemies and giving courage to those who believed heaven fought by their side.